So I'm going to be talking about how to route tiny payments using a protocol called INTERLEDGER. And obviously there's a Node conference, so I'm going to be particularly talking about the JavaScript implementation, which happens to be the main implementation, the reference implementation called INTERLEDGER.JS. My name is Stefan Thomas. I work for a company called Ripple. If you're familiar with the blockchain space, you've probably heard of us. We're not as bad as our reputation. We're actually doing a lot of open source stuff. We're doing a lot of kind of open protocols and that sort of thing. So feel free to ask tough questions in the end. I'm ready. But before that, let's talk about INTERLEDGER. All right. So when we talk about payments in general, like the payment system today is kind of from a different time. It's really been designed in the 70s. The way that banks settle payments hasn't changed fundamentally since then. And so, we as a web community are looking at that, and it feels extremely antiquated. The fact that I send a payment through my bank and I don't know where it is and I don't know what the status of it is, and it takes several days. And some really smart people, some really great companies have built on top of that and kind of hidden the complexity from you. Thinking of companies like Stripe. But the problem is that they're not changing how the system works underneath, how the system works fundamentally. And so, that's still kind of the same as it's always been. And if you're like me, you might wonder, what can any of us do? I'm just an individual developer. What can I do to change the global financial system? Seems extremely daunting, and it doesn't really seem like you could have much of an impact. And that's how I felt for most of my life, until something called Bitcoin came out, and all of a sudden, you feel, wait a minute, this is all just code. I can write better code and see what happens. And so that's kind of what happened to me in 2010. I got really into Bitcoin. I started spending all of my time on it. I wrote the first Node.js reimplementation of Bitcoin, which in fact was the only mining-capable reimplementation of Bitcoin at all. And so I learned a lot about Bitcoin. I learned a lot about Node.js in that time, and just got really deeply into it. Now, fast forward a couple of years. It hasn't quite played out the way that I wanted to. So in the original What is Bitcoin video, which I produced, we were bragging about how low the transaction fees were in Bitcoin. This is the screenshot from the video, and we're basically comparing it to kind of a jab at PayPal, because it was their fees at the time. And in comparison, Bitcoin just has 0.01 Bitcoin, which at the time was less than a cent. And look how cheap it is. And that unfortunately hasn't held true. Bitcoin fees today are just as high as some like wire services. And so you're kind of like, well, what happened? Where did this go wrong? And what we wanted to happen, and what sort of the dream was that it would look more like this, which is kind of the cost development on the internet, where it kind of went down to zero. Like today, per traffic unit, it's basically nothing. Like you don't pay anything for sending data around. And it isn't clearly just technology that's driven this, because the same thing hasn't happened for payment. Yes, technology has enabled this, but there's something else that's driving the cost down, it's driving the price down. And of course, on the other side of that is the volume goes up if the cost goes down, because you're enabling sort of these new use cases. And if you don't have that low transaction costs, there are a lot of businesses and business ideas that just aren't possible. This is an April Fool's joke that Google put out, kind of imagining what YouTube would look like if there was no internet, if you couldn't just send a video over the internet, and you had to ship it. And clearly that's not possible, it's not practical. And so it's not just a coincidence that some of these services have cropped up after the internet has cropped up. And so that's what we want for payments, is sort of this super low transaction costs to enable things that maybe we can't even imagine exactly what they're going to look like, but they're going to be more granular, more, you're paying kind of for the individual things. And I'll give you some example of that a little bit later. So we really want to understand what caused that huge price drop for information transit costs. And the answer, kind of spoiler, I only have half an hour, so can't spend too much time thinking. The answer is really in the name internet. It's this idea of internetworking. I don't know, who here is familiar with the term internetworking or has thought about that concept before? Yeah, like very few people, and I assume you all use the internet extensively, but very few people think about what makes it unique, what is different from other networking technologies. And it's this concept. If you look up the definition, it's like this long thing. But basically what it means is like it's not changing how the networks work, it's just connecting them together. And so that allows the individual networks to change how your frames are encoded or how your transmission medium works and so on. And so you can kind of incrementally improve different parts of the system while still having continuous connectivity across all of it. So you can have a new satellite uplink that has a totally new protocol. You can have better Wi-Fi protocol than before, but the whole network still stays connected, which is actually different than most networking technologies were pre-internet and similar efforts, where people were thinking about global networks, but they were like, well, this is how it works, and this is how it encodes its frames, and this is how it does this. And so when I look at the blockchain space today, I see something very similar, where like people are like, well, this is my blockchain, and this is the one that everyone should use. And at Ripple, we're kind of in the same boat, where we were like, well, we have a better blockchain, you should be using that. But ultimately, it's crazy to think that everyone will just adopt one system like that. And so we're talking about how the cost is driven down. And so I pulled up a slide from like the very early days of the internet, kind of pre-internet economics. And so before the internet, your network is as valuable as the reach that you have. So if you have the most users, that means that everyone wants to be on your network because that's where I can email people, that's where I can buy concert tickets, whatever I want to do. I have to be on a network that has all those services available. I can't just be on a network that only has me and 3 other people, and I can message them, but that's it. And so the value is all in the reach. And that's kind of the status that the payments industry is still in, as we'll see in a second. But what happened is with the internet, you're connecting different networks together, and so reach becomes much less of an issue. If I'm on the smallest network, I can still reach everybody. It might not be as fast as someone who's closer to me, but I can still interact with them, transact with them. And so suddenly the competition becomes about, well, what are the most efficient networks? Because if my network's more efficient and other people's networks are more efficient, then the overall interaction becomes more efficient over time. And so I get a benefit, an incremental benefit, just by having a better provider to the same sort of global reach that everyone has. And that's, I think, what ultimately drove down the cost. It's not, just technological advances. It's not just that people suddenly decided that they wanted cheaper data, or it's not that the use cases drove it. I think this is what drove it. It's the competition where you can't just hide behind your reach anymore. And it's actually a very relevant idea, and I hope that people apply that in other areas like social networks and so on, where it's kind of like today, if I'm Facebook, I'm kind of sitting pretty, but maybe someone comes up with a good protocol that internetworks sort of social networks. So I think it's a very, very powerful idea. So, and this is what it does, is it changes the game from a competition over who's the biggest and who has the most reach to a competition over who's the fastest and who can do things the cheapest. So if we look at any payment networks today, I kind of spoiled this already, but do they do internetworking? Well, Visa has sort of a central hub, and they are kind of a network of networks in that they have lots of banks, but there's only one center, and so they do hide behind their value proposition of reach. They're not advertising how fast they are, that they're a particularly great hop in the internetwork of payments, but rather they're just saying like, we have a lot of reach, so you should be using us. So they're not internetworking. Now, Bitcoin is kind of an interesting case because it's like, well, Bitcoin is distributed, so clearly, you can't say there's a central thing, but you kind of can, because if I do something different in one part of the Bitcoin network, let's say I issue myself more Bitcoin, the rest of the network has to reject that, and they have to not be willing to transact with me anymore. And so it's kind of like we are all in the same boat, and you can see that in sort of Bitcoin governance. And actually, I noticed this already in 2012, where it was like we were trying to do some new feature. And as a web developer, I'm used to deploying a new feature, like, done, let me do something else, And with Bitcoin, it was like, no, we have to now convince everyone, and we have to do politics and get everyone convinced about this. And I immediately noticed that was not going to move very fast. That was going to be like a pain in the ass, to be honest, to advance. So Bitcoin's not doing internetworking either. Everyone's in the same boat. It's not, you can improve different parts of the system independently. So we set out to build a protocol that actually does internetwork for money. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. So it's a project, it's an open protocol, it's a community group at the W3C, a good number of contributors. I think it's one of the larger community groups. And yeah, you're welcome to join if you're interested in this kind of stuff. But maybe for you more relevant is the reference implementation. So we actually, for the last 3 years or so, we've been building this. It's all written in JavaScript, Node.js in a browser, good stuff. And so I want to show you some actual code. This is kind of what you've probably been waiting for. So let's use a little example here of a file upload service. And so today, if you were writing a file upload service, it probably looks something like this. So you have your COA, you have a route, and it's an upload endpoint, and so someone can post a file to that, and then you'll store it somewhere, and then serve it up later. And right now, this is an experiment. It's just a hobby project, right? Like you couldn't make money with this, right? Because you would have to create a sign up, and you would have to have people put in their credit card numbers, and you have to have some sort of billing system, and yeah, there's a lot missing here if you want to make money off of this. However, if you use something like INTERLEDGER, all you would need to make a business out of this would be this. So it's 3 extra lines and 1 extra piece of middleware. So I'll walk you through what's happening here. So at the very top, you have a module I wrote called COA-LP. Don't search for it, it's not up yet. Hopefully posted later. I thought it'd be a little bit further by the time I give this talk, but unfortunately, still working on it. But I'll show you a demo. So you instantiate it. There's an extra thing you have to do where it actually needs an HTTP endpoint where sort of payment notifications can come in. So you register that endpoint as a middleware. And then down here you have ILP paid. And this is something that you can put on any endpoint that you want to have be a paid endpoint. So an endpoint that you can't just call for free. You have to send a little bit of money. And that's pretty much it on the server side. And then let's talk about the client side. So if you're a client, you're trying to upload a file to a server, this is what you might do. You should use streams, but couldn't get it to work with streams. Talked about it later. Yeah, so you basically do something like this. And then let's add the payments, right? So you have a module, again, wrote it, SuperAgent LP. You extend SuperAgent with some extra features. In this case, you have a feature where you can say, I want to pay for this endpoint up to a certain amount of money. And that's kind of all you have to do on the client side. And so with that, I'm going to go over here. And so basically, just run it. So I have a little CLI that calls into that package that does the uploading. And I'm going to upload some package.json file. And it's going to do a bunch of stuff because I have debugging enabled. At the end, it's going to say, upload it to such and such. And so I can go look at, these are the INTERLEDGER connectors that have been running in between this payment. So the way INTERLEDGER connects payment networks is with something called a connector. It's kind of like a router in IP where a router takes a packet of data from one network to the other. And an INTERLEDGER connector takes a piece of money or a little bit of money from one network to another. And so if you want to run a connector, you basically have to set up the connections to 2 or more payment networks. And you have to get some sort of source for what you want to use as the exchange rates. So it knows how much to exchange for how much. And then it will exchange routes with other connectors and yeah, kind of form like a sort of internet for money. And yeah, I could go through this, but it's very, very simple. It's like it first asks how much it's going to cost to make this payment, and then it prepares the payment, and then finally it executes it. So there are other talks on YouTube if you want to hear the absolute details of the protocol. And then for the user perspective, again, it's very simple. You have to do almost nothing. All you do is basically say, here are my LP credentials. These are not real ones, so don't write them down. It's no problem. And then, yeah, here's the version with streams. The problem with streams is that the way that the actual payment module works is it first tries to just call the endpoint normally, basically, and it gives its sort of payment token as a header. And only when the server comes back and says, oh, HTTP 402, you have to pay, does it actually do the payment. And so because we're doing the same request twice, we've already consumed our stream, and I have to get through this little head scratcher to figure out how to get around that. But if you do it with a buffer, you can just resend the request after you've done the payment, and everything works fine. So yeah, that's about it for what I've done this weekend. Hopefully you enjoyed that. Okay. So now you might be saying, so what? Thanks, skeptical Adrian Brody, who keeps sneaking into my presentations. So I want to give you a sense of the bigger picture, like why can I not sleep and, think because I'm so excited about this. Well, the reason is because I think the internet economy is basically like half done right now. It's like the internet is half done. And what I mean by that is that you have all these different protocols and all these different things that you can do online, and they all suffer from the same problem. And hopefully we'll be able to explain what I mean. So think of BitTorrent, for example. If I'm just trying to download files, right? I want to just go and I want to download the file. But BitTorrent says, well, you have to also upload something. And when I first start a BitTorrent, I don't have anything to upload, right? And so the genius of BitTorrent is to say, well, we'll split the files into little pieces, and then once you've downloaded one piece, you already have something to offer other people to trade, right? And so you're basically bartering little pieces of data. And so that kind of works, and in fact, it works so well that it became for a while like the third most popular, a third of the total internet traffic, right? So most popular distributed file sharing protocol. But it's still, it's still a workaround. It's kind of like if you were trying to get something in real life, you would just pay for it. Like you don't go to a restaurant and then you tell them, well, I don't have any money, so maybe I can do some dishes and maybe I can do some advertising for you, and so please can I eat here? No, that would be incredibly inefficient. But that's exactly what we do on the web everywhere, where it's like these hacks to get around the problem of, well, I don't have any way to reciprocate. So I'll give you some examples. So you get this aggregation, so you have marketplaces. We talked about BitTorrent. Well, what was the BitTorrent disrupted by? It was Netflix, right? And so you get these marketplaces where you just aggregate all of your consumption together, and then other people, they aggregate all their content revenue together and get it from Netflix. And then you can make larger payments, and then it sort of works. But it also puts these marketplaces in a very powerful position because it's not as open as the web otherwise would be. And some content creators can't get their content on there. The marketplace might take a big cut. And as a user, like I would love to have more choice and get more content that might not be on Spotify, might not be on Netflix. The other thing that I can do is if I'm using an app, for example, is very popular, that the company just sells my data, right? So I can use the app for free, but then the company turns around and like sells my data to someone else. And quite aptly, Tim Cook points out that in that case, you're not the customer, you're the product. Another example of these workarounds is advertising. So this is the front page of the New York Times a little while ago, but I've highlighted all the advertising in red and I've highlighted all the content in green. And if you're saying that there's no content, well, that's because you need to scroll down. And obviously that's very, very annoying. I mean, like I can't believe that we're even like dealing with this at all. In fact, like a lot of people are opting out. And someone called this the Napster moment for advertising, which is the business model that drives all of this, right? You have Google that's deriving 90% of the revenue from advertising, and they must be scared shitless that their users are, by the hundreds of millions, of opting out of their business model, right? So it's kind of like what happened to the music industry some years ago. And so that kind of creates a need for a new business model. And so my suggestion would be, why don't we do what we do since 5000 BC in every other context where we just use money to solve the barter problem. If I want to consume some data, you send me the data, I send you the money. Done. And all you need for that is money that moves super efficiently, like tiny little increments of money. And I think this can totally disrupt all of the advertising-based business models, all the aggregation-based business models, to everything from Google to Netflix to all these kind of things. Now, I'm not saying that it necessarily disrupts the companies, but it certainly disrupts how they make money. So I'm very excited to see what people come up with. Give you some examples. So this is something that one of my colleagues, who's a co-creator of INTERLEDGER, built, was using WebTorrent. So you basically build ILP into WebTorrent. And so every time you download, you essentially send some money. And so if you don't want to upload, you don't have to upload. There can be people that are only seeding and basically making money off of it. And you can even do things like pay the content creators and turn it into a totally legal system. And so super excited what could happen with this. Here's another thing. We partner with Tumo. I don't know, is anyone here familiar with it? No Armenians? There's one Armenian, okay. So Tumo is a center in Yerevan where it basically is a place where kids can come and like learn about technology, and they're super cutting edge, as you can tell by them having heard of INTERLEDGER. And they basically did a project where their kids, like they have a little class of kids that come in, learn about technology, and they basically built an app where the kids would like build music playlists and kind of curate the music for you, and you could listen to the playlist, and it would just cost you like a tiny amount of money. And again, like we're so used to everything being free that we think like, oh no, I don't want to pay for anything. But it's the way it would actually be, in my opinion, is not that you would pay, little like 10 cents for this, 10 cents for this, and it sort of adds up. But rather, you'd probably have a flat rate because that's what we did in every other context. That's what Netflix does, that's what Spotify does, and there's no reason you couldn't do that. Where it's like you have some provider, they're like your Interledger service provider, and you pay them, $10 a month, $15 a month. You go consume content all over the web, and yeah, you could theoretically consume a little bit more than you're paying in. Some people might consume a little bit less than they're paying in. But the key with flat rates is that it gives an incentive to be engaged with the system. If you're not using a flat rate, if you're paying metered, you're constantly thinking about, I don't want to use this because like it's going to cost me money. But if you have a flat rate, it's like, I need to use this because otherwise I'm wasting money, right? So it's like it gets users more engaged, and that's why ISPs, despite the fact that the less bandwidth you use, the better, they still want you to pay as a flat rate model because they want to keep you engaged. They want you to cancel your subscription because you don't need the internet, because you never use it, because you're always worried about how much it costs. So I think that people will come up with a flat rate model for this, where they kind of aggregate what you do. And sure, there will be some people that abuse it, just like there's people today that max out their bandwidth every single day, all the time, and so they get kicked off their ISP. Same thing. So that's kind of how I envision this working. Here's another example of how Interledger sort of makes payments more open. So we've been engaged with the W3C, as I mentioned, and they formed a working group for web payments. And they've put out 2 specs so far. One is sort of the interaction between a merchant and the browser. The other is between a wallet and the browser. And the guys from Chrome were nice enough to put Interledger into Chrome Canary so you could actually play around with it. And so we built a little app where you can register an Interledger wallet and then go to a sort of mock merchant. And as you click pay, you get that native browser UI, and then you get sent to the wallet UI, which is what's happening now. And then the browser crashes, which Chrome, fix your shit, and then you're done. And so it's a very beautiful sort of flow. And yeah, the crash is out of our hands, but hey, you can vote up the issue if you want. We'll give you the link. Yeah, so that's that. And I think that's, I may be less excited about that because it's still kind of a normal payment. I think the micropayments is where it's at. That's where the really interesting stuff is. But the point I wanted to make with this is the fact that it's an open protocol, right? Like, it's hard to convey it, but like, it's not tied to Visa. It's not tied to MasterCard. Like, I could start my own provider that offers this protocol in, rural Kansas, and that's it. That's my sort of catchment area, and I still have that global reach where I can pay into someone's Chinese account and someone's African account, and it would be much more like the internet. It would be very unlike payments as today. So yeah, I'm curious to see what you guys build. If you want to get in touch with us, we're at Interledger on Twitter. I'm at JustMoon. There's a website, interledger.org, that links to the W3C group if you want to join that. Probably the best way to reach us right now is Gitter, because we found that we have an IRC channel, but people will come in, ask a question. It'll be like 2 a.m. for us. We'll find the question, and by that time, the person's already left. So Gitter is recommended. And yeah, thank you.